In this talk, I wanted to outline some of the results of two of our long-term studies of greater gliders. And I want to focus on two places in particular. One is the Central Highlands of Victoria, where we've worked since 1983, and the Jervis Bay Fire Study south of Sydney, where we've worked since 2002. And work on greater gliders is important in both of those areas, but in quite different ways. So the wet forests work started 37 years ago. We also have other work in the Tumut and Nanangrow areas west of Canberra. We're not going to talk about those today, but greater glider is a prominent part of the animal assemblages in that space. And Buddaree National Park, as I said, since 2002. So let's go to the work in the wet forests of Victoria. Now, this is work that's been based on two forest types in particular, mountain ash and alpine ash, but also shining gum forests, which are a peripheral element to the forest types in that part of the world. What we've found is that there's been a very steep decline in the occupancy of sites in the last 20 years. So essentially what's happened is that the number of occupied sites by the greater glider has declined from roughly 2/3 to 16% in the last year. What we see though is that there are some key drivers of decline as summarised in this paper, which is to be published in the next few weeks. If we go to the next slide, what we see is that the greater glider is declining. This is the first column with the first red arrow. We can see that the species is strongly related to the number of hollow-bearing trees per site. So you can see in the second column. The third thing that we can see is that there's an effect of the amount of forest that's harvested in the landscape surrounding the sites. And there's also an effect of the amount of fire in the landscape. So that means that we can see that over time, populations of hollow-bearing trees have been declining, but the relationship of the occurrence of animals with the abundance of hollow-bearing trees remains very strong. But as we harvest more of the landscape surrounding the sites, or more of the landscape is burnt by fire, then these are drivers of decline. The important thing is that even when we take that into account, we still have a decline in populations over and above what can be explained by those drivers. So importantly, the species is sensitive to the amount of logging in the landscape, both on sites. The species doesn't occupy sites that have had a logging history in the last 20 to 30 years, but it also is driven down by logging in the landscape that surrounds the site. So in our long-term studies, our sites are not logged, but the surrounds of those sites can be logged. So here's an example. This is actually a site that's reputed to be variable retention harvesting, even though it's barely distinguishable from a typical clear cut. But what we're talking about here is how the landscape is changing. So this is the location of logging coops in one landscape where we work. You can see ANU research site 379 here. This is the yellow area which has remained unharvested. But essentially we see in these white areas the logging coops that have been overlaid on the landscape since the 1990s. So the fabric of the landscape is essentially changing from one that's been previously intact to one that's now extensively disturbed. And these kinds of landscapes are actually extremely common across this Central Highlands area that we have worked in since 1983. In fact, we've looked at the value of these areas for conservation for 70 forest-dependent threatened species in Victoria, and then overlaid that in terms of where we are likely to see further logging in the landscape as part of the timber release plan. And we see very strong overlap between the two. That is, areas of high conservation value for animals such as the greater glider and other forest-dependent species, and where the timber release plan is scheduling harvesting in the next 5 years. And we can also see that these landscapes are also very highly disturbed. And the important statistic here is that within intact reserves, the distance from an intact area to a disturbance boundary is about 1,700 metres. In the wood production forest, the distance from an intact area to a disturbance boundary, such as a road or a logging coop, is 71 metres. So enormous differences in terms of the level of fragmentation of the landscape. And as we've seen before in the case of the greater glider, it matters. Fragmentation matters in terms of the species' continued occupancy, long-term occupancy of sites. The species is also very sensitive to wildfire. And what we've seen is that there's a long-term decline in the species long after the fires that occurred in 2009. So the important thing about this landscape is that we've been monitoring populations of the greater glider and all other species of arboreal marsupials long before the fire in 2009 and for a decade after the fire, and we're continuing that monitoring. And one of the reasons for the strong decline in the species after fire is fire has consumed large numbers of these hollow-bearing trees, which are a critical part of the habitat requirements of the greater glider in this system. So large old trees, such as these trees shown with the entire village of Fernshaw around them, are really quite fundamentally important habitat elements for species such as the greater glider. And we've actually been documenting the change in populations of these trees. This is a picture of the late David Blair, numbering and measuring a population of large old trees, and then returning to sites and then measuring what's happening. So we can see that there's a strong decline. On the left side, the number of large old hollow-bearing trees per hectare, and at the same time, the shape of the curve basically essentially matches the rate of decline that we're seeing in greater gliders across the landscape. Importantly, we can also see that the proportion of greater glider habitat trees is strongest in old growth forest and mixed forest, and lowest in regrowth, 80-year-old regrowth forest and young forest that's regenerated 30 to 40 years after logging. And there's a fire severity effect on the number of greater glider habitat trees, as we can see here, from unburnt through to severely burnt. And there's other effects such as the elevation of the sites. The other thing that's important here is that we can see that the kinds of trees that are most likely to be occupied by the greater glider, you can see in this red dash here, are trees of very large diameter. And they're precisely the kinds of trees that are now being lost throughout these landscapes. So if we look at the state of the forest, this also tells us about the perilous situation of the greater glider in these kinds of environments. Essentially what we've seen since the 2009 fires is a very substantial loss in the amount of old growth cover. So the amount of old growth in mountain ash forest is now 1.16% of what it was historically. So historically it was around about 30 to 60% of the landscape was old forest, and now that's been reduced to just a bit over 1%. And those patches of old growth are actually highly fragmented. They're distributed across almost 150 different patches. The situation in alpine ash is even more dire. 0.47 of 1% of the landscape is old growth forest. And a few weeks ago, we published an assessment of what's happened to old growth across Victoria, and nearly 80% of the old growth estate in the state of Victoria has been lost since 1995. Now, in some ecosystems that are not logged, such as subalpine or montane snow gum woodland, extensive disturbance there, almost completely related to fire. But in the damp and wet ecological vegetation class, 85% of that system has been disturbed, and that includes some of the most important habitat for greater gliders. And that information has been summarised in a paper that was published in mid-August, approximately a month ago. So why does a lack of old growth matter for the greater glider? We already know that the species is strongly associated with old growth ash forest. We also know that the condition of the forest at the time it's disturbed has a big impact on the recovery process for many elements of biodiversity. So a fire in an old growth forest leads to very different kinds of conditions after fire than a fire in a young forest. And what we've seen is that in old forest, the fire itself is lower in severity. Animals are more likely to persist in old forests when they are disturbed, and the recovery process of the forest itself is much faster, and the recolonisation of burnt old forest is faster than burnt young forest. The other thing that's important is that young forests tend to burn at higher severity. And this matters because of the impacts on the forest itself. So young forests burn at higher severity. We can see this with this left skewed relationship with the two red arrows here. So essentially what happens is that young logged and regenerated forests do not burn for the first 7 years. And then there's a steep increase in the probability of a canopy fire or a crown burn until the forest is around about 35 to 40 years old. And then there's a steep decline again with low fire severity around about 100 years old and older. So the important difference here is that there's an almost 7 times difference between fire severity at 7 years and not long after. Now this left skewed curve shape that Chris Taylor found in his work in Conservation Letters is now being seen in other forest types and in other areas that we've been working in around Victoria where we've done detailed empirical analyses. So again, we have age class along the bottom here, and we have the probability of a crown burn here, and we can see this steep peak for young forest, and then the decline. So this is really important to understand why some fires are so severe and the impact on the forest as a consequence of the age of that forest. We also can see that this kind of crown burn risk that we're seeing with a similar kind of shaped curve is no longer confined just to ash forests, as we can see down here, but we're also seeing it in lowland forests and dry forests. Now, it's important to understand that some people, such as some of the foresters in University of Melbourne, are saying, well, no, this is only seen in one study and we don't really believe it's happening. The reality is that work done by Peter Adderwall from University of Melbourne is actually showing a very similar shaped curve to the one that we just saw for the work led by Chris Taylor. So it is important to understand that the history of recurrent fire and high severity fire in many areas of forest throughout southeastern Australia, which has impacts on species such as the greater glider, is associated with a past disturbance history by logging. Nevertheless, there's still quite a deal of unexplained variation in the data for decline for the greater glider. So we think that there's an effect of climate change that we will test in the next 10 to 12 months. And there's also an interaction between the structure of the vegetation and microclimate, something that we're testing at the moment. So there is a difference between microclimatic conditions that are experienced in older forest versus young forest. And those microclimatic differences may well have important implications, particularly when we have very high maximum temperatures, not only during the day, but also at night. And we also have extreme rainfall deficits that can be very important in terms of influences on greater gliders. We already know that there is a lag effect on site occupancy of extreme drought. That was in some work that we published in 2011. As part of our work on large old hollow trees, many people have been suggesting that nest boxes might be an important answer to the problem of a deficit in hollow bearing trees. And so we implemented a 10-year nest box study in these ash forests using standard nest boxes and looked at occupancy patterns over that 10-year period. And we had nest boxes that were set low above the ground, high above the ground, in old forest and young forest. And one of the most important things in this case was that not only were there relatively few colonies of leadbeater's possum, but in fact there were no greater gliders at all detected in any of the nest box sites that were established. So this is a fairly sobering outcome. It doesn't mean that nest boxes will be ineffective. It means that there's a lot more work to be done to understand the dynamics of hollows in terms of their thermal properties and the kinds of nest boxes that might be needed to bring greater gliders back into these kinds of systems. Okay, what I wanted to do now briefly is talk about what's been happening at Buderi National Park. So Buderi is an exceptionally beautiful national park. It's south of Sydney. In many respects, it's like Sydney, except without all the urban development, coastal heaths, beautiful coastal blackbutt forest, woodlands, a highly diverse area. And since 2002, we've been doing the long-term monitoring at more than 130 sites located throughout this area. It's a stunning national park that's co-managed between Parks Australia and the Wreck Bay Aboriginal community. And it was important to understand what's happening to the fauna in relation to fire, in relation to predator control and weed control. And part of that process was to do spotlighting surveys of animals, including the greater glider. And so at the beginning of our surveys, roughly 30% of sites were occupied by greater gliders. And suddenly by 2007, the species was extinct. And to this day, the greater glider still has not been seen in the last 13 years across this area of approximately 6,500 hectares of nature reserve and national park. So what is happening? This was a highly unexpected result. And what we think is happening is that with time, there's been an extensive amount of fox baiting that's taken place in this reserve. You see a strong relationship. This is a path analysis. Over time, we've driven down the number of foxes through poison baiting. But there's this quite odd relationship with the decline in the greater glider at the same time there's been a decline in foxes. And it's hard to know what the outcome is here in terms of the relationships between predator control, increases in the number of herbivores. Obviously, these animals don't climb trees to where they're going to be catching greater gliders. Herbivores such as macropods don't eat greater gliders. So understanding what the relationships are between animals is very difficult to piece together. There's been a slight increase in the number of large forest owls, although many of them have now gone extinct. There has been a strong increase in the number of brush-tailed possums, which may be a predator for a competitor for hollows with the greater glider. And it's possible that the level of fox control actually increased the number of ringtail possums, and there's some evidence of that, before the number of owls started to increase with the loss of foxes. And so it's very difficult to piece together what has actually taken place in Buderi. We know that there's been a big decline in the number of foxes, a big increase in the number of brush-tailed possums. Now there's been a big decline in the number of forest owls, and the ringtail possum is now almost extinct as well. So do we need to control owls? I think that's highly unlikely we can do that. Do we need to control brush-tailed possums? That's a possibility. We need to look at this experimentally. Do we need to stop controlling foxes? That's not really an option given the importance of Buderi National Park for iconic other animals such as the eastern bristlebird. Another possibility is to add predators such as the dingo and the tiger quoll. But the big issue here is that the greater glider is very slow to recover. There are greater gliders in areas outside the park, but not within the park. And it may take an intervention such as a translocation of animals from outside the park and into the park to start to test some of these problems. The difficulty is that extensive areas outside of Budari National Park have been burnt in the last fire season, 2019-2020. So the solution to the problem really is not tractable at this stage, given all the other circumstances. And this is a true conundrum of trying to understand how to manage these unexpected and unexplained declines of a whole range of species, not just the greater glider and the common ringtail possum, but now many other species of small mammals in this iconic national park. So to summarise here then, we've seen major declines in greater gliders. The species is very sensitive to fire, it's sensitive to logging, it's sensitive to the combination of fire and logging, it's sensitive to losses in old growth, losses in large old hollow trees, and it's likely to be sensitive to climate change. So there's extraordinary challenges in conserving these species. So the reality here is that the greater glider, which used to be almost the most common species detected in large-scale spotlighting surveys, is now becoming extremely rare. And this is not only the case in the Central Highlands region and in the Budari region where it's now extinct, but it's also the case in other parts of southeastern Australia. So we need to be careful about species that used to be common now becoming extremely rare. And if we're not careful, rare species will become extinct in the wild. And all of the data now indicate that it is time to intervene, to not monitor these species to extinction, but to think about how you reduce the number of stresses for species like this, how you increase reservation where you have less stresses, how you increase old growth forest, and how you think about where fire does and doesn't affect the landscape so that you can leave refugia such as those areas with suitable food resources for animals such as the greater glider. There's probably no more greater challenge to deal with a species that seems to be sensitive to so many different factors, and those factors interact: fire, logging, predation by owls, loss of old growth forest, changes in composition of forest types, which in turn can influence food suitability. So the greater glider is really a species to watch out for. It is a clear sentinel species in terms of indicating change, and we are going to have to intervene and intervene quite radically to be able to conserve this species in the future. Thank you very much.